Good morning, and welcome to Positively Politics, the show where we break down the sometimes complicated and often negative world of politics in a straightforward and academically rooted way. My name is Dr. Merrifield Wilson. I'm a professor of political science at the University of Indianapolis, as well as the host of this show. I want to talk to you today about political assassinations, and in particular, attempts in political assassinations, because if you've caught this show regularly, if you've listened before, you know that Positively Politics is all about asking questions, inciting conversations, bringing in data and historical context to give us a greater sense of political events happening around us. And oftentimes I personally feel overwhelmed by all the headlines, the sound bites, the clickbait, if you will, but just so many things going on. It feels impossible to really have a deep dive, to delve into why something matters and the way in which it impacts us, and even understanding the background behind the event, the context, right? And that's what I really like to do on this show. If you were paying attention to the political news last Saturday evening after the show, you know there was an attempted presidential assassination at the White House Correspondents Dinner Saturday evening at the Washington Hilton. And while the assassination was ultimately thwarted, this was absolutely another horrific reminder, I think, of political violence as on the whole. But it provides us with the opportunity to look beyond just the individual, right? The person who incites this kind of violence and the specific circumstances, but really to get a better sense of how these manifest, these attempted assassinations, right? And what they mean, why they're motivated, why they feel so emboldened to do something like this, and the way in which our escalating rhetoric involving just really sometimes mean, nasty, hurtful, hateful things, emboldened, I imagine, probably in part because of the internet, social media, the thin veil of anonymity in which you can say and just really spew horrible, hateful ideas, but you can do it through the internet. So it feels much more anonymous, right? And what impact this has on our politics. I don't necessarily mean policy per se, but the dynamics through which we view and understand politics in the world. We've had many failed presidential assassinations. I'm going to highlight a couple. We'll talk then about motivations and then about outcome. We've only had 4 actual sitting U.S. presidents that have been assassinated, going from Lincoln to Garfield to McKinley and then Kennedy. But there have been many more attempts on presidents' lives. And I want to trace through some of those, getting a better understanding and sense of why these happen, what motivates these in the first place. And then, of course, that impact. What does it mean for us in politics, and what could we expect in the future? Let's start with these 3 presidential assassinations that we have had in our country. Of course, Abraham Lincoln was the first president assassinated at the end of the Civil War by John Wilkes Booth. Right? Lots has been studied and said about this. James A. Garfield was assassinated just about 20 years later in 1881. I highly recommend, if you have any interest in Garfield's assassination, reading The Destiny of the Republic. I read it when this book came out. This was by Candace Millard. Back in 2011, it feels so long ago, 15 years ago. It is fantastic. Millard traces through history. She talks about Garfield's roots as a poor farm boy, his unusual rise to politics, which does feel a little bit like a trope, but he was someone who really just wanted solutions and didn't see himself in this grandiose sort of way. He ultimately gets elected as president, and shortly thereafter is assassinated by Charles Guiteau, a man riddled with mental illness, delusions of all sorts, but also probably fueled by the patronage system, which up until that point was how bureaucrats were selected. So Guiteau had thought, well, he was responsible for helping Garfield get elected. Guiteau had written and sent him speeches, none of which we believe Garfield ever utilized. But nonetheless, Guiteau was a rabid, enthusiastic supporter of Garfield. He felt he was owed a political position when he was denied one. He was naturally quite disappointed and turned to anger and violence, ultimately assassinating the president. In addition to the destiny of the republic, as we're on the Garfield assassination topic, I would also add Netflix came out last year with an incredible series. It's Death by Lightning, and it highlights, I think, not just really Garfield as a president in his short tenure in office at that, plus the assassination, but Charles Guiteau and his life and really his aims, his motivations. Of course, he thought he was going to be so well known and regarded. He would forever be famous. And yet, truly, I don't think many people would even recognize his name. And quite frankly, unfortunately, necessarily James Garfield and his assassination. After Garfield, another 20 years, William McKinley is assassinated in 1901. And finally, the fourth president, the last president that has been assassinated in our country, John F. Kennedy, of course, in 1963. Now, I'm focusing on failed assassination attempts, in part because that's what we saw a week ago, right? Yet one more attempt on the president's life. And President Trump, like many modern American presidents, has had many attempts on his life. What we saw last Saturday at the Washington Hilton was a video game developer from California, a guy who traveled all the way to Washington, D.C., seems to have run past security checkpoints and fired what we believe to be, at best estimates I've seen, pretty consistent, up to 8 shots inside the lobby. Ultimately, he tripped, fell to the ground. No one was injured. He was immediately arrested. He's since been arraigned on charges. But this is yet another assassination attempt, right? An individual trying to hurt, ultimately trying to kill the president. And when you think about individuals in political power in these elected offices, the reality of assassination attempts is most unfortunate, because if you are choosing to serve in public office, first and foremost, I'm going to get this out of the way. I say hats off to you, as I say to every person running for office, whether or not you even win. And we're coming up, I live in Indiana here, this to our primary election. We've had early voting for quite a while, but as you think of election season, right, you will in any given race only have one winner, which means you have at least, if you have competition on the ticket, one loser. And it is hard to run for office. It is going to be very taxing emotionally, physically, financially draining. It's going to take a lot out of you. So I applaud anyone who says, yes, public service is where I can contribute. But when you think of people who then win in that office, not only have you already made the decision to run and to do this, but the people have selected you. So you have a responsibility to the people. You should be in public. You should be shaking hands. You should be visible. And I will say most elected officials want to be. That is part of why they ran. They do feel that sense of duty and service. And so when we talk about these attempted assassinations, this political violence, I think it represents obviously an unfortunate place where we are in society, but I also think it's highly problematic because this violence is aimed at people who should represent the public. They need to be public facing, not always, not indefinitely, not under every circumstance, but more so than many other roles in life, they are going to be the name and the face, and they are the person who will be out front, making them most especially vulnerable to this type of political violence. And I think that is the irony. I think that's the paradox. That's the problem when we see what feels like an escalation in both negative, aggressive rhetoric. And I don't just mean negative in terms of like disagreeing with someone's policy. That is great. That is democratic with a lowercase d. That's good. That's what we need. You should have that in government and politics, right? I mean negative in terms of petty politics, in terms of being personal, in terms of nasty, dirty, mean, cruel comments. But those kinds of comments that then breed into violence and acts of aggression, even threats of aggression for that matter, there should be no place in American politics for these kind of things. And yet it seems we see them occur more often now. I want to remind you you're listening here on WICR 88.7 The Diamond. If you're not tuned in The Diamond, maybe you're catching this on one of the podcast forums. You can now catch Positively Politics wherever you get your podcast. I'm Dr. Laura Merrifield Wilson here for Positively Politics as we're talking about attempted presidential assassinations. Now, I discussed, of course, the attempted assassination from last week, what we saw at the White House Correspondents Dinner. There have been several other attempted assassinations on President Trump's life. I think most notable was during the 2024 presidential campaign. And you saw in July of that year someone attempt to hurt the president by shooting. The president was whisked off the stage, but you had the pictures, I think probably most notably, of the president holding his ear, right, with blood, being injured, but not ultimately killed in that assassination attempt. And the reality is, if you go back, nearly every modern president, we typically figure out the timing for modern presidents, beginning with FDR, right? So beginning with FDR's administration, the modern American president, right? Nearly everyone has had some sort of public failed assassination attempt. Recognizing, of course, there's some sort of subjectivity there. There have probably been attempts that were thwarted that are not publicly known. Even when we go back historically, I wanted to highlight ones that I thought were most notable for whatever reason. Starting with Richard Nixon, Arthur Bremer had aimed to try to assassinate Richard Nixon. He'd written in his journal and diary, he was one of two people he was going to try to get most likely for notoriety, as we can tell based on Bremer's writings. And ultimately, he wasn't able to reach Nixon. And instead, he was at a public rally in Maryland where George Wallace, not a president, but a presidential candidate and former governor, and he becomes governor twice more after the assassination attempt was. And Bremer shoots, injures, paralyzes, as a matter of fact, George Wallace from the waist down, obviously does not kill him. But that was a really important assassination attempt. And in an interesting way, when we say, like, what were the motivations and effects, when you look at Bremer, and a lot has been written about Arthur Bremer, he had a very sad childhood, dysfunctional family, right? Some things that we'd say probably make sense. And also, lots of people have sad backgrounds and don't choose to kill public figures. He wanted attention. He wanted recognition. He wanted to be important. And he had mental health issues where he thought that he disagreed with who was in charge. But he writes in his final journal entry that he's going to attempt to assassinate. He wants to reach George Wallace. And one of the interesting things is he wasn't anti-segregation, right? He didn't disagree with Wallace's feelings on race. Keep in mind, this was in 1972. So George Wallace is running as a third-party candidate for president. He's best known for throwing the gauntlet down on segregation back in 1963 with his stand at the schoolhouse door at the University of Alabama, preventing 3 African-American students from enrolling, although they ultimately do. That was during the Kennedy administration. But he got great notoriety for that. And so Wallace runs as on the platform of race as a anti-segregationist candidate. And Bremer doesn't have a political preference on this. It's not super important to Bremer, right? He's much more interested in getting recognition and how important that is. He's not surprisingly later diagnosed with schizophrenia, a schizoid personality disorder, and then psychologists debate whether he has some paranoid or psychopathic features. Right? He's not well. But that's the Arthur Bremer focus on both Richard Nixon and eventually on George Wallace. Gerald Ford had several assassination attempts as well. Again, this is the 1970s. I think of the general distrust and apathy amongst Americans, although distrusting your government is not the same as trying to to physically hurt them. But you had, in September of 1975, 2 assassination attempts on Gerald Ford, both related to the infamous Charles Manson. The first was on September 5th by Lynette Squeaky Fromm, trying to aim a .45 caliber pistol at Ford when he reached her to shake her hand. It didn't go off. She was quickly restrained by Secret Service. But then 3 weeks later, another one of Manson's followers, Sarah Jane Moore, is effective at essentially firing towards the president. This is President Gerald Ford. She doesn't hurt him, but she does strike another bystander, slightly injuring, does not hurt that person significantly either. She, of course, is then taken, indicted, found guilty, and then imprisoned for her assassination attempt of the president. When I look at the motivations, and that's one of the things I think about for any of these, it's not surprising that many of the people who have been indicted and served time for presidential assassinations have mental challenges. But I find it fascinating to see that they're not all politically motivated, because I think that separates out, it complicates a little bit. Sometimes our assumptions about assassination attempts, about anything in politics, we assume that anything in politics is everything in politics. It's all politically motivated. And what I've found out is that's not necessarily true. And I want to remind you that you're listening here to WICR 88.7 The Diamond, or wherever you get your podcast. I'm Dr. Laura Merrifield Wilson, here for Positively Politics as we talk about failed assassination attempts. You might say inspired, motivated by last Saturday's thwarted attempt at harming President Donald Trump, another assassination attempt. And while thank goodness it didn't come to fruition, right? I think it's important to look at why people do this in the first place. And I talked a little bit about Brimmer. I also talked about Squeaky Fromm and Sarah Jane Moore. Right? Those were people who attempted to assassinate presidents or presidential candidates in the 1970s. And while that was 50 years ago, I think they highlight some of the divergence, the different motivations that we see for people that are trying to hurt an elected official. In this case, I'm focusing on presidents or presidential candidates. And some of the motivations are political. Right? Sometimes people are upset with the current chain of events. They're upset with what the president is doing or not doing in office. They dislike the approach. And that is thus far what we've seen from Cole Thomas Allen. He's the 31-year-old from California who last Saturday traveled to Washington, D.C. and shot what we believe to be 8 rounds inside the lobby of the Washington Hilton during the White House Correspondents Dinner. Thankfully, not hurting anyone, but seems to be politically motivated based on the alleged manifesto that Allen had shared just shortly before he began inciting violence. Oh, there are also those individuals who are interested in the spotlight. And this feels like such a double-edged sword for media coverage, because we've seen this with school shootings too, right? Where people do this because they want attention, right? They want to be famous. And unfortunately, we want to cover it, which does then give them the exact thing they were seeking in the first place. I try, even as talking about these failed assassination attempts, I talk a little bit about the people who were the failed assassins, if you will, right? But moving beyond that, because they don't deserve the recognition. And yet we want to have information. It's more than fair to want to know who was trying to do this. Why were they trying to do this? You want to have an analysis, an understanding of their life. I think we have to do this, both in the media, but also, quite frankly, academia in terms of social science and really psychological, maybe sociological research, because we need to understand why these happen to help prevent them in the future, right? What is it? What's going on? To me, it's our political dynamics. How can we control our political dynamics in a way that prevents people from going about this later on? You say, like, you really dislike what the president's doing? Is this the solution? No, never. Violence is never the answer. I even think the negativity in terms of comments, the dialogue and the rhetoric, and I want to be clear here, I'm not saying you can't criticize the policy. You can, you should, you have an American right to do so, and you owe it to democracy to challenge, to provide insight, to disagree, right? To question why. No, I'm talking about the cruel, biting, nasty, mean, hateful remarks, right? I think about this all the time when we see examples, and not just of people responding to elected officials. Let's be honest, elected officials partake in this too, where they will say something absolutely awful. And I think, not just as a political analyst, but I think as a professor, and I think as a mother, and I think people watch, people pay attention, people take stock in this. If this is the reality we create, then that's what people come to expect. Even as we talk about these failed assassination attempts, let's talk about one that was not failed. When Lee Harvey Oswald murdered President John F. Kennedy in November of 1963. I think about this when I have conversations with my parents, and that was a really important moment for baby boomers. That was the question. It was the where were you when JFK was assassinated? And that was felt throughout the country, regardless of whether or not you were a supporter of his, regardless of or not of whether you had voted for him. For my parents, they were too young to have voted, but it was very important in their childhoods and their memories. Much to the equivalent, I would say, of the Challenger explosion for my husband, who's a part of Gen X. And for me personally, as a millennial, 9/11 and watching the towers fall. Right? Those are like those quintessential generational moments. But to talk about those, when we're talking about the failed assassination attempts, when we're talking about the ugly language, of course there's a connection. We escalate tension. We escalate conflict with words. And on one hand, I don't think we should be surprised at all when things like this happen. On the other hand, I think rather than just saying, well, yes, it's because of certain factors, like the way we talk about politics, we talk about each other, we might say, perhaps we shouldn't. And I think about that with the nasty comments all the time. Perhaps we don't. You can think something and you don't have to say it. You can have a personal opinion that might be mean, and you don't have to share it. You can just keep that one to yourself, right? You don't have to say all of that. I think about that as a parent, quite frankly, and a professor. And I want to remind you that you're listening here to Positively Politics. I'm Dr. Laura Merrifield Wilson. Whether you're catching this on WICR 88.7 The Diamond or wherever you get your podcasts, I want to thank you for tuning in as we're talking today about failed presidential assassination attempts. Now, I want to give a shout out to my friend Cora. She mentioned there's a Stephen Sondheim musical called Assassins. And I think it does highlight the fact, not just that anything can be a great topic for a musical production, but also that we recognize there's a lot at stake. There's a lot of assassination attempts. There's a lot of political violence just on the whole aimed at presidents in particular. And there are a lot of, I should just expand, doesn't have to be just aimed at presidents, but because presidents are seen as the name and the face of American politics because they are the most recognizable figure. And much to the chagrin of political scientists, such as yours truly, a lot of times people will focus on the president and fixate. That individual is the reason everything is bad in their lives, especially individuals, right, who maybe aren't mentally well and are really struggling with some other life challenges. Even people that are, we'd say, mentally healthy, perhaps, but maybe not as sophisticated in understanding American government, it is often the case that the president and the governor for the state level, as the unilateral chief executive, is seen as the name and face for good reason. For voters, whatever's going on at the federal level, they will attribute, whether it's credit or blame, to the man, thus far it's always been men, in our state and governor and at the federal level as president, to that person in charge, right? So it's credit if it's good, it's blame if it's bad, but people will oversimplify that. And that's one of the consequences I think we have to look at when we look at presidential assassinations. Beyond the motivation, what kind of impact, what kind of effect does this have? It was fascinating to me when you looked at the White House Correspondents Dinner that this happened in the Washington Hilton Hotel. Right? This is a place which is supposed to have impressive security. I actually found it fascinating doing research on this. This is outside of this area, is where Ronald Reagan was infamously almost shot, right? Talk about another failed assassination attempt. This was John Hinckley Jr. back in March 30th of 1981 outside the Hinckley Hilton, as Secret Service now sometimes informally refers to it. He was not politically motivated, by the way. In fact, Hinckley later testified that he was trying to oppress actress Jodie Foster in attempting to assassinate President Reagan. But that's the same venue where we saw the attempted assassination a week ago. And when we talk about the impact and ramification, the very simple fact is you're going to have to escalate security. You're going to have to emphasize safety, right? More metal detectors, more processes, more Secret Service agents. And that's, like, quite frankly, just feels like the most obvious cause and effect. But I also think we have to stop and say, is there a way we can address this that's beyond just more safety and security? Is there a way we can acknowledge, let's say, the vitriol within our politics? Can we agree to de-escalate? Can we agree to call out people who say things that are not beyond just hurtful, right? That are aggressive, that could be used by someone to say this is the moment for action, and action can only come in the form of violence. If we don't do that, and so far we really haven't done that, then amping up security, spending more money on safety, right, is the only thing we can do. And yet you shouldn't feel that safe and secure. We can recognize it doesn't thwart individuals. It doesn't deter people from trying. It doesn't deter people from getting hurt. Thank God no one was hurt last Saturday. But there are a lot of examples of these failed assassination attempts. I mentioned Hinckley aiming to assassinate then President Ronald Reagan on the steps of the Washington Hilton back in 1981. He didn't get Ronald Reagan, right? But he did get 3 other individuals. One person who ultimately died back in 2014 of the injuries because of that failed assassination attempt. So even when the president isn't injured, other people are. And this seems like such an obvious, easy answer, but I think we owe it to ourselves to hold ourselves and others accountable in terms of rhetoric, in terms of language, in terms of what feels like a natural, but is not a predestined escalation of aggression. Right? Sure, if you keep saying ugly, hurtful, hateful things, people will take it to heart. And if one side says it, the other side says it more and louder and more often. And then the other side says it. Right? Like, yeah, that's just how it works. But it doesn't have to just work like that. If we hold ourselves accountable, I think that's the first place to start. We hold our quote unquote side, our party, our leaders accountable. And then we do the same thing for the other side. It's going to be a little bit easier for the other side if we're being really honest with ourselves, right? You point to someone and you're pointing a finger to them, but you're pointing 3 fingers back to you. So I've heard some people say 4, and I don't know where your thumb is in that situation, but if you do the pointing finger right now, I've really got just 3 fingers pointing back to me. That's more than enough to remind ourselves, though, that it's important to provide that introspection, to hold ourselves and our sides accountable as much, if not more, as we do other individuals with whom we may not agree. But being able to do something like that while challenging, while truly the most group project of group projects within a democracy, would be another option, another response, another result of something like this. And unlike ramping up security and safety, which I recognize must be done, is important, will be done, it's unavoidable, right? It will cost us more in terms of resources. Money, I'm not being that cheap here, I promise. But yes, it will cost money. It will require more individuals. You're talking about manpower, so to speak, right? It's going to cost us more in terms of emotion and psychological resources. Like just thinking through, okay, just expect there are crazies every single day. There are people that are going to try to hurt you, and for no reason but your political perspectives. Going through that process, that's going to take a whole lot more, certainly in the long run, than it would be to honestly and candidly, kindly, with nice words, address our political differences, de-escalate, and consider the manifestations of those kind of actions versus the aggression we see. And I want to thank you for tuning in today for Positively Politics. Remind you, you can catch the show wherever you get podcasts, as well as here every single week at 11:30 on Saturdays. Here for WICR 88.7 The Diamond, I'm Dr. Laura Merrifield Wilson.